Good morning. For this talk, can I ask you to quickly pause the video and grab a pen and a piece of paper on which you can write? And the reason for this is that in the first part of the talk, we will be looking at a series of simple experiments and questions, and it will be hugely beneficial to help in appreciating what we cover in the second part if you attempt to write down some answers. But do understand that what answers you come up with aren't going to be marked, and you don't even have to reveal them to anyone else if you don't wish to. But if you are watching with other people, it could be fun. The main issue is that you apply your mind to try to come up with an answer, even if it is just a reasonable guess, as the process of committing something to paper means you make that much more of an effort to push yourself in a way that you won't if you just try to think of an answer in your head. And so, having grabbed that pen and paper, let's begin. Now, one of the big issues facing society these days centers around how we look to raise our children, and as an extension of that, how we should be treating and viewing other people. And the push via the media and various other influential bodies is that we literally need to treat everyone as if they are special and have a range of given rights. Now, on the surface, that sounds acceptable and good. But that is only the case if we are viewing this idea through lenses that are pigmented and governed by the opposite of this concept. And by this I mean that the opposite viewpoint is that we view people negatively and have a poor or wrong impression of them. In a nutshell, we are innately prejudiced against them. And so what we find is all of these catchphrases like Black Lives Matter, gay rights, feminists, human rights, and so we can go on. And what the media and various groups push is that if we are not 100% for these causes, that if we don't 100% agree with them and stand by them, then by default, we are against them. They put it that there is no middle ground. You can't have a neutral or balanced view on the subject. And I think it falls very much into that situation best summed up by that classic scenario of where if someone asked you whether you still beat your wife, it's not a question you can answer with only a yes or a no, because both answers would imply that you did or had beaten her in the past, whereas the truth was that you never had. And so coming back to our issue of how we, say, raise our children and possibly view other people, we are governed by the Bible and its principles. And God's view of mankind, in many cases, will be in direct contrast to how the world wants to see and accept mankind. And this puts us in a difficult position in that we will from time to time have to stand up for what we believe. And this will be taken badly by most people. And obviously we're not meant to ram our viewpoints down people's throats, and we always need to be careful to focus on the actions or deeds rather than the person themselves. And so we need to take the path more of condemning the sin, not the sinner. And so when we look at our children and how they are being raised, we see many issues in our modern society, like helicopter parents, parents who, in a sense, hover over their children, ensuring that no harm can come to them, making sure that everything goes according to their plan and idea of how their children should get on in life. And they're not left on their own to find their own way, to experience their own ups and downs. We find overindulgent parents, parents who give to their children whatever their children demand. There's no limit placed on what they can ask for. They just overindulge them. We also find parents who are fairly slack, if we can term it that, in terms of dispensing discipline or instruction to their children. They take a back seat in this regard. And we can straight away see in some of these issues the problems that can arise when children are raised in this manner. And this more modern phenomenon that we also come across, where every child must be rewarded, irrespective of whether they deserve something or have earned it. And so we find the situation where there is almost a discouragement of a first or second place in whatever it might be. It could be, for example, an athletic race or an academic reward in class. And the rationale behind it is that each and every child must be made to feel worthy and receive some form of prize or reward, irrespective of how they've performed and what they have achieved or how much effort they've put in. And the argument behind this again is that if some children receive a prize and others don't, those who don't will feel unworthy or inadequate, and they say this can lead to all sorts of problems later on in life. And we can easily see the problem here. It sounds reasonable and fair that children may feel this way. But think of the consequence when you go down this road. You can end up creating children and eventually adults who feel entitled irrespective of the effort they have put in. And while you can paper over the cracks when they are small, when they become adults, the world and life won't treat them like that anymore. Although, as I've said, there are some who try to make out that all people are special. And so this can lead to bigger issues later in life, and there are a range of social issues that can then manifest themselves as a consequence of this. And one thing the Bible very clearly spells out is that life is not fair. As much as man detests this and tries to change it, Jesus says that God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. And we may not like that. We want the evil and the unjust to be punished. We want them to suffer. And we want those who are just and good to benefit and have an easy life. But Jesus says it isn't like that. And we read of Jesus that he himself was made perfect through suffering. So here was the greatest man, the most just man that has ever lived. And yet he himself was made perfect through suffering. He suffered injustice. He suffered things that ultimately led to him being made perfect. But God doesn't mince words when it comes to man. We read in Romans chapter 3, Paul says, therefore all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We read in Mark chapter 7, Jesus says here, for from within, out of the heart of man, came evil thoughts. And in Psalms, David says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. This is David, a man after God's own heart, saying these words. And again, we read from Paul in Romans chapter 3, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. So these are harsh words. God, as I said, is not mincing words when it comes to man. And Jesus leaves us in no doubt as to his opinion. Jesus says even of himself, why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. If any man could have called himself good, it was Jesus. And yet he says even for himself, don't call me good. There is only one good, that is God. And so Jesus really encapsulates the contrast between man and God. But you wonder sometimes whether we really appreciate how great God is. And so I want to do a few experiments with you to help us in this regard. And while it won't be possible at this stage to perform these during this talk, you are welcome afterwards to carry out some of them yourself. But let's just use our piece of paper and jot down some of your answers or guesses. And as we go, I'll give you some of mine. But as you'll see, the answers aren't necessarily specific. They more just might depend upon you as an individual. So let's start then with our first question. And if I asked you to measure how much water you think you could hold in your cupped hand, so just holding up your hand as I've got in that picture and cupping your hand, trying to squeeze it tightly so no water can leak out, how many milliliters do you think you can hold? If you just poured a glass into your hand, how many milliliters do you think you could hold in the cup of your hand? And you're going to just have to take a guess. I did the same thing. When I looked at it and I looked at the size of my hand, I thought, probably about the volume of a tot of liquor. So you think of those small little tot glasses that they use to, I think they called it a shot glass, to measure out liquor. And I thought that would probably fit in the cuff of my hand, and granted my hands are maybe bigger than yours. And a tot is 25 milliliters. So hopefully you've jotted down your guesstimate. I was quite amazed at how little water actually I could hold in the cuff of my hand before it started leaking out. And the answer was only 11 milliliters. It wasn't even half of that tot that I thought I could hold. So I was quite surprised. Our second question, what is the measurement of the span of your hand? And I've put a picture up there. It's just the span, as you can see in that diagram. It's from the thumb to the tip of your small finger. That's what they call the span of your hand. So it's that distance measured across, and you might be able to look at your hand and start trying to guesstimate what you think that distance is. And it's quite easy to go and do yourself at home. All you need to do is just take a pen, draw it around your hand so that you've got the shape and the size, and then take a ruler, put the ruler across, and you can quickly measure the span of your hand. And obviously that's going to vary depending on the individual. If you're a child, if you're a woman, you have slightly smaller hands than men. I've got actually quite large hands. But a span is, from a biblical perspective, is given a measurement of 9 inches, and this equates to 229 millimeters. So I'm not sure what you happen to jot down as your answer as to what you thought the span of your hand was. The span of my hand happened to be a little bit bigger than this, 255 millimeters. But as I said to you, my hands are maybe slightly bigger than the average. Our third question is, how many dust particles can you fit between your thumb and 2 fingers? And you can see the way I've positioned my hand there, we're creating just this tiny little point between those 2 fingers and your thumb. And when you look at that size, if I actually take a small piece of hair and put it between my thumb and my 2 fingers, I'm still able to pull that hair out. I can't actually grab that hair. It's probably, when we look at it, that little space located in there, probably about the size of a human hair. So you could take one strand of your own hair, put it between there, and you wouldn't be able to grab it with those fingers. You'd be able to still pull it out. So again, we're looking at how many dust particles do we think we can fit in that space, essentially. How many dust particles can we lay side by side to form the same width as a human hair? So if we just look at some dust maybe on a table, and dust can vary from the minutest amount to slightly bigger. So we're just looking at large dust particles. And what you find if you do that, as I've pulled this off the internet, is that it's somewhere around about 10 to 40 large dust particles equal the width of a human hair. So that little space that you've got between your thumb and your 2 fingers, the width of that space, or the diameter of that space, is around about 10 to 40 large dust particles. Then we come to the biggest mountain, or the tallest mountain on the earth, and it's Mount Everest. And if I asked you, how many kilograms or tons do you think Mount Everest weighs? Now, nobody's ever been able to measure this. You can't go and physically pick it up and find a scale big enough to weigh this ginormous mountain on. But surprisingly, on the internet, people have sat down and actually tried to calculate what they think this mountain might weigh. So if you've made your guess in kilograms or tons, hopefully you've written down some form of guesstimate, and I'm sure this is not something anybody would know, and it is a guesstimate anyway, because these scientists or guys have tried to just calculate this from what they can measure. And the answer they've come up with is this huge number, 162 trillion kilograms, or 1.6 billion tons. We can't even begin to comprehend the size of that. It weighs more than all the human beings on our planet. It's just a huge, huge number. Our fifth question. Write down quickly the 5 most powerful or influential leaders in the world. And again, it's your opinion as to who you might think are the 5 most powerful leaders, but do you know 5 names of the 5 most powerful leaders or technological giants on this planet? And just 5, and think of Britain, America, China, Russia, Australia, France. And so we have a range of leaders we could choose from, and we're just looking at 5 of them. Hopefully you're not choosing South Africa. And these might be some of them. Kim Jong-un, Johnson, Merkel, Putin, Biden, Macron, Xi Jinping, even Trump, if this was a talk we had done some time ago when he was the president of the United States. So these are some of the most powerful leaders in the world. Our next question, number 6. How many stars do you think you could count with your naked eye if you went out into the bush or into a desert far away from the influence and effect of city lights? City lights mask the vast majority of stars that we can see in the sky. But when you have gone out into the bush, out into the Midlands, into a game farm or a desert, and looked up at the sky, I'm sure you've been amazed at the number of stars that you can see in the sky. And if you had the ability to be able to count those stars with your naked eye, how many stars do you think you could count? And obviously this is not possible to do, because in the process of counting them, the Earth keeps rotating, and so you would lose track of where you were and the stars that you could count. But if you took a photograph of the night sky, you would be able to go in there with a pen or pencil and mark out and count the stars that you could see. And hopefully you've written down some answer as to what you think you would be able to count. And the answers, they estimate, is around about 5,000 stars. That's all you can see in the night sky and count with your naked eye. 5,000 stars. So it's not a huge number. You tend to think that there's a lot more out there. Our next one is, how many stars do you think there are in the universe? So taking all of the entire universe, what they have seen through telescopes and calculated and estimated is out there, taking all the galaxies with all of the stars that are in each galaxy, and however many galaxies there are, how many stars do you think there are in the known universe? And I don't think any of us could even begin to pronounce the number. But you might want to just write down a number with how many noughts you think might exist after that number. So I'm not going to waste too much time on that. Just while you're thinking about that number, when you are out in the desert or in the bush and far away from city lights, and you happen to look up into that sky, you might often see this kind of band, this thick, almost sausage band of stars that angle diagonally across the night sky. And that band of stars that you see is actually our galaxy in which we live. So we live in the galaxy called the Milky Way. And so because we are in it, when we are looking at it, we are looking through that plane of the stars, and that is the band that we are actually seeing. So the bulk of those stars are from the galaxy in which we live. Many of the other, what we think are stars that we see outside of that, are in fact actually just other galaxies containing stars themselves. And so we are located far out in the outer reaches of our galaxy, far away from the violent and dangerous radiation and gamma rays, etc., that exist in the more violent heart of the galaxy. God has placed us out in a fairly benign area, well away from any danger. And just looking at a artist's impression of our galaxy, it's this kind of flat disk with a kind of bulge in the middle. And as you can see it in that picture, that's pretty much what you are seeing. Obviously, we're slightly embedded into that galaxy, but we're seeing that fat line of stars, which is our Milky Way. And so answering our question, scientists and astronomers reckon that the average galaxy, and obviously each galaxy varies, that there's probably around about 100 billion stars in the average galaxy. We've got quite a big galaxy, not the biggest, but a fairly big one, and they estimate we have about 300 billion stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way. And scientists calculate that there's probably in the region of about 125 billion galaxies out there, all with an average of 100 billion stars. So when you times those out, you get this truly ginormous number, 12,500 million stars. It's just not a number we can even begin to comprehend. And if you actually look at the number of stars in the universe, it's calculated that there are more stars than there are grains of sand on the seashores of the entire coastline of our planet. And you just think of the number of grains of sand you can hold in your hand. And just think how many stars there are out there. So there's 12,500 million stars out there. Our final question, can you name just 5? All I'm asking for is 5 stars and write down their names. And please remember, don't mix up the difference between stars and constellations. We all know the signs of the zodiac. Those are constellations. They are a grouping of stars that form a particular image. We have various other ones, Orion, the Big and the Little Dipper, and so on we go. Those are constellations. Don't name constellations. I'm looking specifically for just 5 stars out of all of those other ones that we had, and see if you can come up with 5 names. And surprisingly, when I've done this talk before, I don't think I've ever found anybody who's been able to actually come up with 5 names of stars. And I don't think it's the pressure of the moment. It's just not something we generally know. Maybe if you're an astronomer or do study stars or look into them, you would know many more than that. But for the average person, can't even come up with 5 stars. So let's have a look at 5, and we've got a lot to choose from. Hopefully, you guys all got the sun. The sun or sol is our star here in our solar system, the one we see every day. And hopefully you didn't forget that that is a star and is one that you should have remembered to name. Second one, Polaris, or also known as the North Star. It forms part of the Little Dipper constellation. It's another one that's quite well known. We also have Sirius, also known as the Dog Star, and forms part of that constellation. Then Proxima Centauri. I'm sure you must have heard of this particular star, located in close proximity to Alpha Centauri. Alpha Centauri is way, way bigger than Proxima, but the reason Proxima Centauri is more famous is because it is the closest star to us. So in our galaxy of 300 billion stars, Proxima Centauri is the closest star to our sun. It's not a very significant sun, quite small, or star, it's quite small, but it is the closest, around about 4.2 light years from us. And 4.2 light years is just a distance, again, we can't even comprehend. If we got into our fastest space rocket, we'd be dead before we got there. It would take us so long. The distances are truly unimaginable. And then our last star that I'm going to mention is this one called Betelgeuse. Funny sort of spelling, but that's how you pronounce it, Betelgeuse, much like the juice that you drink. And it's part of the Orion constellation. And that's a photograph that they've obviously taken of it through a telescope. But just to give you some perspective as to why I chose this particular star, if you look at this, the size of it, in that bottom left-hand corner, you'll see the size of Betelgeuse, and below that, the size of Earth's orbit around the sun. So we orbit about 93, I think it is 94 million kilometers from the sun. And that small little gap that we see there is Earth's orbit around the sun. It comfortably fits inside the size of Betelgeuse. In fact, even Jupiter's orbit around the sun, which is way further out, this star, Betelgeuse, would extend in its own right beyond the orbit of Jupiter. That's how big it is. And just looking at it in comparison to other stars that exist in our galaxy, the biggest they think is this Antares. There is some debate on this, and you can see next to it the size of Betelgeuse. But if you look down right at the bottom of that diagram, there's a little arrow pointing towards our sun. And I don't think you can even see it there. So this is all to scale. Our sun, in comparison to Betelgeuse, is like a pixel on the screen. We can't even see it. And I have to enlarge it for you to even begin to see just this tiny, tiny, tiny little dot compared to Betelgeuse. So Betelgeuse is just a truly humongously huge star compared to our sun. And make no mistake, our sun is a big star. But why have I gone through all of these questions, and what was the point? Well, it was all to lead us to Isaiah chapter 40, because we want to look ultimately at the greatness of God. We looked at God's opinion of us in terms of how he sees us, and Jesus how he views us, and Paul. But when we come to the greatness of God, do we really appreciate how great he actually is? And Isaiah in chapter 40 goes a long way to trying to help us to appreciate the level of greatness. So the first verse we're going to go to is verse 12 of Isaiah 40. And God says there, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand?" And God here is talking about all the water on this planet, all the rivers, all the oceans, all the dams, all the lakes. And God, in a sense, is saying here that he is capable, as is shown in that picture, of taking all the oceans, the dams, the lakes, the rivers, and just putting all of that water in the palm of his hand. Remember when we measured, I came up with 11 milliliters, and I've got big hands. God says he can hold all of this in the hollow of his hand. Going further into verse 12, we read there that God has marked off the heavens with a span. And that diagram I've put there is a diagram I've pulled off the internet, and it's showing essentially what they feel is the look of the universe. And each of those dots is just probably groupings of galaxies. You won't even see stars in that particular diagram. And the diameter or width, if you want to term it that, of the universe, astronomers estimate that it's somewhere in the region of 93 billion light years. And that number, again, is just beyond our comprehension. And yet God is saying that he can take his hand and mark off the heavens, this 93 billion light years, with the span of his hand. That's how great God is. Further in verse 12, God says that he has enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure. And a measure in Hebrew is those three fingers, your thumb and those two fingers. And with those three fingers, God has said he can enclose the dust of the earth. When you think about the dust of the earth, just think of the earth itself. The entire earth is almost made up of dust. We are made of dust. And yet God says that he can hold all of the dust of the earth. Everything, every single sand particle and piece of dust that makes up this planet. God can hold it between the measure of his fingers. And yet we could only hold 10 to 40 large dust particles, the width of a human hair. This is the God that we worship. And further on in verse 12, God says that he has weighed the mountains, not one single mountain, not just Mount Everest. He has weighed the mountains, all of them, in scales, and the hills in a balance. And we said Mount Everest alone weighs 162 trillion kilograms, 1.6 billion tons. And God can simply weigh all of them together in a scale or a balance. In verses 15 to 17, we read, "Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket and are counted as dust on the scales." We just think of a bucket of water and letting a small drop of water drop into it, as in that picture. And it just makes that small ripple in that bucket. Or the dust on scales. Those scales that we've got there, and if you just sprinkled some dust on there, it wouldn't even affect that scale. It wouldn't move. And God says the nations, all the people on this planet, are just like that drop in the bucket. They are counted as dust on the scales. Nothing. We are nothing before God. Carrying on in verse 15, he says he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. I mentioned this earlier. Have you ever held a handful of beach sand and wondered how many grains there must be just in that handful that you hold? There must be thousands, hundreds of thousands of grains of sand that you can hold in your hand. And yet for God, all the beaches and that sand is just like dust in his hands. In verse 16, Lebanon would not suffice for fuel. Back in the days when this was written, Lebanon was known for its magnificent forests, huge forests. These great forests of Lebanon with their magnificent cedar trees, Isaiah says, are not enough wood for a fire for God. Nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering. And I've put a picture there of that migration of wildebeest and zebra as they pour through the Serengeti and through that river and have to face the perils of the river and the crocodiles waiting to eat them. Hundreds, thousands, millions of these animals every year migrate through that. And yet Isaiah says, nor are the beasts enough for a burnt offering. There aren't enough animals on this planet to make a decent sacrifice to our God. And we read, all the nations are as nothing before him. They are counted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. And that picture just showing hundreds of thousands of people gathered together. And yet Isaiah says they are counted as less than nothing and emptiness. Currently, there are 7.8 billion people on this earth. And yet this number is nothing when you compare it to the number of stars or even galaxies for that matter. And in verses 21 to 24 of Isaiah 40, has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth. Isaiah wrote these words over 2,700 years ago. And only when you get into space can you fully grasp what he is saying and how accurate it is. The earth forms a perfect circle. And Isaiah says that God is the one who sits above the circle of the earth. And we know this for a fact now because we have spacecrafts. Now we can send cameras and people out into space to verify what Isaiah wrote 2,700 years ago. And its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows on them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. Rulers come and go. The Hitlers, the Stalins of the world have come and gone. They are like stubble. Just ask Trump, who has come and gone. In verse 26, lift up your eyes on high and see. Look into the night sky and see. Isaiah is challenging us. Who created these? When we look at all those stars in the night sky, ask the question, who created all of this? He who brings out their host by number? Think about what God's saying here. It's like he's toying with us. How do we even begin to comprehend a number like 100 billion times 125 billion? And yet Isaiah says he brings out the host, or he brings out all these stars by number. And he goes on, calling them by name. Every single star. Isaiah is saying God has given a name to it. And we try to remember 5. Just 5. And we weren't that good at it, were we? And yet God has given every single star in the universe its own name. And he's done this by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, and not one is missing. Not one single star has God lost or misplaced in all those millions and millions and billions of stars. God hasn't lost one, hasn't misplaced one, hasn't forgotten its name. We have absolutely no idea or comprehension of how great God is. It's not in our makeup or our understanding to begin to grasp his greatness. And yet he wants to have a relationship with us. And not just any relationship. He wants to be our Father. He wants an intimate relationship. And I guess I have nothing more to say. So I end off with God's words from the rest of this chapter. And he says from verse 28, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This is our God. This is our Father. Amen.